Welcome to a debate in the race for the 18th Congressional District from the studios of KDKA-TV in downtown Pittsburgh.
Hello and welcome to our debate between the candidates in the special election for the 18th Congressional District. I'm Ken Rice from KDKA-TV News. It's my privilege to serve as debate moderator. Let's welcome the candidates, Republican Rick Saccone and Democrat Conor Lamb. And I'll be joined in the questioning by my KDKA-TV News colleagues, Money and Politics editor John Delano and reporter and talk show host Lynn Hayes Freeland. Here are the rules for the debate. The candidates will have 1 minute to answer each question and an additional 30 seconds for rebuttals. The questioners may jump in with follow-up questions, and we'll make sure the response times are equal. Finally, each candidate will have 2 minutes to deliver a closing statement. So let's begin. Gentlemen, the first question is mine. Mr. Saccone, the National Rifle Association wants you to win this election. You have its endorsement, you have its A+ rating. Mr. Lamb, you have a commercial that tells voters you love to shoot, and it shows you firing an AR-15. And after last week's horrific tragedy at the high school in Florida, you've both been on record suggesting that mental illness is the real issue, not guns. A majority of Americans tell the Pew Research Center we should ban assault weapons, ban high-capacity ammunition clips. And now these passionate students and parents in Florida are demanding that Congress do something about guns. Can the gun lobby and 18th District voters count on you to do nothing? Mr. Saccone.
So first of all, I'd like to say thank you for having this debate tonight. We've had a terrible tragedy, and my thoughts and prayers go out to the families and the victims of that. My wife and I have actually been praying for them for the last several days, and will continue to do so. The left's first response is always to disarm law-abiding citizens whenever there's an incident like this. I think we have to look at the underlying causes of what would cause someone to go out and commit such a heinous act. There were many laws were broken by this individual. There were many warning signs that were missed. So the system needs to be refined, and we need to enforce the laws we have on hand. 37 times a sheriff went out to his house to talk to this individual, and he actually had an involuntary commitment. We call a 302 in Pennsylvania. In Florida, they call it something else. And yet, that was never reported to the federal government. That would have prevented him. That would have showed up in a background check and would have prevented him from buying that weapon. So there are lots of things we can do. We have to focus on the mental illness. We have to focus on the underlying causes in our society, the breakdown of the family, the culture of violence that we've created that are contributing to these type of events.
Just to attempt to pin you down here, is that a yes, that you will stand firm against calls for new laws restricting access to guns, certain weapons, certain types of ammunition or associated equipment?
I've always been for, and I have bills going through the legislature right now for strengthening our gun laws and also holding people accountable. My legislation on consecutive sentencing is one that if you commit a crime with a gun, you should pay the price. So I've always been for sensible regulations and laws and enforcing the laws we have on the books right now.
Mr. Lamb, are you promising to stand up to those who are calling for changes to individual gun laws?
Well, Ken, let me first say that I take Mr. Saccone at his word that his thoughts and prayers are with these families and with these parents. Unfortunately, his votes have not been. In Harrisburg, he has called for the virtual elimination of our background check system. He has even spoken out against Chuck E. Cheese for not allowing firearms in their stores. What I am calling for right now is a response to this tragedy that actually sticks and that actually makes some progress. I recognize that there is great passion on both sides of the gun control debate. And we have seen too many tragedies happen with no action afterward. What I would like to see is a background check system that actually works. Right now, it is full of holes. And so I will do whatever it takes to make sure that our background check system has the information it needs, whether about people with mental health conditions or people who have convicted crimes. And I'll also make sure that those charged with using the background check system are held accountable when they fail to do so.
So the majority of Americans who tell Pew and other pollsters that they're in favor of banning assault weapons, they're in favor of banning high-capacity ammunition clips, you're telling them they're wrong. You do not support that.
I do not support that. I've been thinking about violent crime for a long time as a prosecutor, and most of the cases that I saw were committed with handguns and by people who are already not allowed to have those firearms. So I think what we should do is strengthen the background check system we have, because that's where people actually say they want to work together. People on both sides of the aisle are in favor of this, but we have to actually do it.
Mr. Saccone, 30 seconds.
Oh, the allegation about Chuck E. Cheese's and so forth, that's just from left-wing websites. Look, that came from a law enforcement officer that was denied entry to a Chuck E. Cheese's because he was carrying a weapon. That has nothing to do with my legislation or my votes. We have a PIC system and we have a NICS system. The PIC system is very costly and has many errors, and it takes state police off the patrols that they're on. I voted to change that and go to strictly to the NICS system, which is a much more reliable system, much less costly to the taxpayer. So that's what my opponent is referring to, but he doesn't have the facts straight on it.
Mr. Lamb, rebuttal.
Ken, the cost to the taxpayer is not the issue here. We need background check systems that work, that don't have holes in them, and we've seen too many of these shootings happen because someone fell through the cracks. It's going to take people who are willing to reach across the aisle, who are willing to stay late, and who are willing to spend some money to fix this thing, and I don't believe my opponent is willing to do so.
I just want to spend a few more seconds on this question, just very quickly to both of you. Mr. Saccone, is there a single gun law, not background checks, not mental health, a single gun law you would change, or will you resist those calls? You've heard the calls from Florida.
As I say, I have 5 bills going through the legislature right now
on associated issues.
Laws. So yeah, they're on issues that are related to this. So I've always been for making the laws better and stronger. So that's my record.
What gun would you try to make access to more difficult?
As I say, it's not about making access to a gun more difficult.
Okay.
It's making sure that law-abiding citizens only have access to the weapon.
Mr. Lamb, is there a gun? Is there a piece of equipment that you would try to make access to more difficult?
I think the problem of crime prevention is much more complex than banning individual guns, but
okay.
I would like to see efforts like those by Senator Toomey and Manchin to close the loophole.
Okay, fair enough. Next question goes to my colleague, John Delano. John.
Gentlemen, let's talk qualifications. And Mr. Lamb, we start with you. Those opposed to you say that you are one of the least qualified individuals to run for Congress from this area. You have never held elected office, you've never served in any legislative body at any level of government, or even run for office until now. And if elected, you would be among the youngest members of the U.S. House. Should voters simply overlook this? How should voters balance your lack of legislative experience with that of Mr. Saccone, who has served 4 terms in the State House before running for Congress?
You know, John, most people that I've met have told me they want a representative who works for them. And I learned a lot when I was in the Marine Corps about working for and serving our people. The lesson I really learned was that you leave no one behind. And too many people in Western Pennsylvania feel today that they're being left behind in a political system where the extremes on both sides are locked in a constant struggle with each other. There's nothing but gridlock out of Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, we've seen the same thing in Harrisburg with people like Mr. Saccone. So if that's the experience that he's offering, I don't think that's the one that our voters want. They're happy to have someone new because it's time for us to change the way things are done in Washington.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. Saccone, on paper, you do have more legislative experience than Mr. Lamb, but you've been part of a legislative body that many say is too partisan, dysfunctional, and way too expensive. In fact, you allegedly claimed per diem expenses in Harrisburg 20% more than the average state lawmaker. So why should voters send you to Washington to clean up the swamp when you've been part of the swamp in Harrisburg?
Well, actually, I disagree with that premise. I've never been part of the swamp. I've always been there cleaning up the swamp in Harrisburg. Most of my bills have passed either unanimously or nearly unanimously. So that means that even my ardent opponents have voted for my legislation. That's important. I've voted for shrinking the legislature, expanding our access to the wine and spirits in grocery stores and so forth. Castle Doctrine, I ran on bringing the Castle Doctrine to Pennsylvania, and we passed that in 2011. Tort reform, a number of bills that I've been either responsible for or co-sponsored, bipartisan bills, bipartisan legislation. So I have a record. This is record over rhetoric, and I have a record of doing what I say. And my opponent has no record. A candidate can say anything he wants. And how many times have you been disappointed by people who say they're going to do something, but get into office and don't do it? I've actually done what I said, and I have a record to prove it.
Mr. Lamb, is it your rhetoric versus his legislative accomplishments?
Well, John, I didn't hear any response to your question about the per diem and the expenses, and that is an example of a situation where Mr. Saccone has said one thing and done another. And that sounds familiar to me because that's the same thing we got with Tim Murphy, and I don't think people want more of the same.
Do you want to respond on the per diem?
Absolutely. That's another source from a left-wing so-called news source. It's not even a news source. Look, I don't take the state pension. I don't take the state car. And we get so much money in our budget to run our legislative offices every year, every session. I return money back to the taxpayer every session. So I actually spend less than I'm authorized to. So again, the left wing likes to throw out all these nonsense, but they only give you part of the story, and they try to twist and turn it for their purposes. My record stands strong. My constituents know exactly what I've spent. They've tried to do this to me for the last 8 years that I've been in office. It hasn't worked before, and it won't work now.
Mr. Saccone. Last week, the state's first medical marijuana dispensaries opened, including 2 locations here in Pittsburgh. You voted against medical marijuana, and currently the U.S. Attorney in our area has not decided whether to prosecute any cases involving the medicinal cannabis, which does remain a federal but not state offense. My question to you is, should the parents of children who need this drug for relief of a variety of different medical conditions be fearful they could face prosecution?
So this is a tough issue, and I sat through, and my heart goes out. I met many of the parents that believe that this medical marijuana will help their children, but I sat through many of the hearings that we had across this state, listening to the experts on this subject. And the experts told us that the science says that the medical marijuana is not helping in the way that they think. In many ways, if they're young people, it could actually hurt them. That's why I voted no on that bill, and that's why I continue to take that stand, because I just listened to all the experts that came and testified before us in Harrisburg and across the state, and we heard from experts across the country on this issue. So that's why I took the stand that I did.
And those parents, however, who believe it could benefit their children, should they be afraid of being prosecuted?
Well, we've passed the law in Pennsylvania, so the clinics are opening, so they'll have access to it.
Mr. Lamb, as a former federal prosecutor sworn to uphold federal laws, how can the federal government be expected to look the other way on the distribution of medical marijuana? Is it realistic that the feds can overlook some things and not others? And do you believe parents in particular of children with medical needs should be afraid of prosecution?
I don't believe that any parent or child should be afraid of prosecution if they're following the advice of their doctor. And that's what's happening here. Many doctors have told me that these oils that come from cannabis are very useful, and they're often much cheaper than more expensive prescription drugs. So I would like to see the research continue, well-regulated sale and distribution of these drugs. And I believe that my former office and all of those in law enforcement have great discretion to focus on the worst offenders. We have a terrible heroin epidemic in our part of the country. Gun violence still plagues many of our streets. That's where I've always felt the focus should be. That's where my focus was as a federal prosecutor. And I hope that that's where it remains.
Thank you.
Okay. Rebuttals, or are we good? I'm
sorry. Rebuttals? I think we're good.
All right, Mr. Lamb. The White House says as a direct result of the Republican tax plan, more than 350 companies have given their employees raises, stock bonuses, or some other benefits, perhaps raise their minimum wage across the board. That tax bill, as you know, passed with 0 votes from Democrats. You've been a critic of that tax bill. Have any of the good things that have happened for workers since its passage changed your mind?
Ken, I'm very happy that our working and middle-class people are receiving more money in their paychecks. I've always been for middle-class tax cuts. What I'm not happy about is that I think people's health insurance premiums are now going to go up. And we've added $1.5 trillion to our national debt. We didn't need to add a penny to our debt to have the tax cut for our working and middle-class people. We now know that 90% of that $1.5 trillion went to the 1%, people who earn $700,000, $800,000 a year, into our largest corporations. It was a giveaway. I don't think that was right. So to answer your question, my mind has not changed. I think we should have followed those who said that we should have limited it to a working and middle-class tax cut without adding a penny to the debt.
Mr. Saccone, what about the debt? Because even after accounting for projected economic growth that may result from the tax bill, there are numerous independent analyses that conclude that it could add $500 billion, maybe up to $2 trillion to the debt. Is that okay with you? And if so, don't Republicans care about debt anymore?
Yes, and depending on how fast the economy grows and how far, we'll be able to reduce that. The important thing about this tax cut is it is so popular among people in the 18th District. As I go around, small businesses, employees, It's not the crumbs that Nancy Pelosi and her crew on the left say. These people are very happy to have the bonuses that they received. Many of them have a little bit extra money in their pocket. They may take a vacation this year, or they may invest it in fixing up their house. Many of the small businesses say they would be happy to blow out a wall and expand into the next room, or maybe buy some equipment that they were waiting to buy they couldn't afford before, but now they're going to buy. Or people that are getting a little bit more into their 401ks, or a little bit better health care that their employers are going to provide. Everywhere I go across my district, and I can give you source after source after source of small businesses. My wife was a small businesswoman for 27 years. I helped manage her business, and I was an international business. I know the importance of these tax cuts and what it does to help our economy grow, and that's why it's so important. It's very popular with the people, but the Democratic Party has been against this under the guise that it's not for the middle class. Well, I'll take you around the 18th district, and I'll show you a lot of middle class people that are very happy with it. I'll be happy to take you on that tour anytime.
Mr. Lamb, 30 seconds.
Our people know who this bill was for, Ken. It's for the same people who are funding the dark money campaign that we're seeing here in Western Pennsylvania. We have to remember why this whole discussion of tax reform started. It's because people like Warren Buffett pay a lower effective tax rate than their secretaries. All of those loopholes that you heard about that we needed to close, they still exist. In fact, there's more of those loopholes now because this bill was written for corporate donors.
Mr. Saccone, 30 seconds.
I mean, look at all the benefits of this program. The standard deduction being doubled. You know, many people won't even have to get an accountant to do their taxes anymore. I can remember when I did my taxes without an accountant. I used to do them myself, but I haven't in a number of years. But maybe this year I'll be able to do it by myself, just because of that standard deduction alone being doubled. Even with all the money that we give to charity, we'll probably be able to. The standard deduction will cover it, and I won't have to have someone else do my taxes. It'll be simplified, and that's another thing that the American people wanted about their tax reform.
Thank you. Next question, John Delano.
Mr. Saccone, over a year ago, you told me on camera that you were Trump before Trump, meaning that you long ago embraced his policies of today. So if voters vote for you, are they essentially getting a Donald Trump clone in the Congress, just another rubber stamp? If not, where and on what issues, and please be specific, do you disagree with the president?
Look, we voted in an agenda back a year or so ago. It's an agenda on smaller government, cutting spending, cutting taxes, repealing and replacing Obamacare, taking care of our veterans, rebuilding our military, securing our border, protecting our unborn children, enhancing our Second Amendment rights, appointing Supreme Court justices, conservative justices to the Supreme Court. I was for most of those issues in 2010 when I ran in the State House, and we've addressed those issues since I've been in the State House. That's where I came up with the saying that I was Trump before Trump, because I've been working on those issues before then. And President Trump came along and nationalized those issues. Those are the issues that the people of the 18th District have told me that they're most interested in. And do I disagree with the president on anything? I do. He happens to be a Patriots fan, and I'm a Steelers fan all the way.
Is that the only issue on which you disagree with President Trump?
So far, as long as we stick to that agenda, we'll be fine. We'll keep moving along, and that's what the people want, and that's what I'll be working on.
Mr. Lamb, you're running for Congress in a district that backed Donald Trump by nearly 20 points because so many of your fellow Democrats in this area abandoned your party. So you call yourself a moderate, willing to work with the president and Republicans, but isn't this election really a referendum on President Trump? So give us some of the Trump policies that you like. In short, why should any Democrat who voted for the president and who likes his policies support you over Mr. Saccone?
John, there are a few names that will not be on the ballot on March 13th. One is President Trump's name, another is Nancy Pelosi's name. But boy, you hear those names a lot in this campaign. What I've heard out on the trail is that people are sick of that. They want someone to represent them. I've told them time and again, I'll be happy to work with the president on the issues that affect us here, especially the heroin epidemic. I think the president deserves great credit for declaring an emergency and proposing some funding for it. But there are some issues where we really disagree as well. And I, for one, won't write a blank check to anyone, not to the president, not to Nancy Pelosi, and certainly not to Paul Ryan. I think that's what people want. So we have a budget, for example, right now proposed by the White House, and it cuts $250 billion for Medicare. A promise we've made to our seniors here in Western Pennsylvania. I'm not for that. So no matter who the leader is, no matter who proposes it, I'll stand up against it and I'll stand with our people here in Western Pennsylvania.
Mr. Saccone, why should Democrats who supported the president vote for you?
Democrats have always voted for me. I was elected, how I got here, I was elected in a 76% Democrat district that was gerrymandered to keep a Democrat in power. And it worked well for 26 years. Democrats voted for me because of that agenda that I just outlined for you. They had faith in me that I would stand by and work hard for those issues. And I've delivered on every one of those promises, from the Castle Doctrine all the way to property tax reform. Candidates can say whatever they want to get elected, as I said, and they will. But I actually have a record. This is record over rhetoric, and I have a record, and I've done what I said, and Democrats will continue to vote for me because they want that agenda. It's what they tell me when I'm at their doorsteps and in their driveways and in their basements. That's what they tell me they want, and that's what I've been working for already.
Mr. Lamb, did you want to respond to anything here?
This is not theoretical, and it's not rhetoric. The budget that cuts $250 billion from Medicare, that cuts $1 trillion from Medicaid, that's on the floor of Congress right now. Mr. Saccone will be for it. I'll be against it. It's that simple.
Can I have a rebuttal to that?
I think we've had the two
you had the two
rebuttals,
rebuttals?
so I think
Okay.
we're done. Yeah.
Mr. Lamb, you would go into this job with very high hopes, very high expectations. What is the very first bill you would introduce?
I'd be in favor of a bill to take on and tackle the heroin epidemic that's killing people all over Western Pennsylvania. It's going to require a lot of money. It's going to require a lot of time. But if there's one thing I know, it's that we need to build rehab facilities and put beds in them where people can stay, not for 30 days, but for 90 days. And they need medical insurance afterward. They need treatment. This is about saving our people. It's an issue that's complex, and we will need bipartisan agreement to do it. We're going to have to be willing to make some investment. We will not get this work done if we have people in Congress who are afraid to make an investment, who are afraid to stand up for our people, who always stand with the lobbies, the corporate donors. We've got to save people, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to do that.
Mr. Saccone.
Yes, there are many issues coming up that we'll be faced with as we approach, but I do have a heart for veterans. My grandfather served in World War I. My father's a D-Day veteran from World War II, Bronze Star, Croix de Guerre. I served 18 years in the United States Air Force. Both my sons serve in the military right now. I serve on the Veterans Affairs Committee in the State House, where we have made so many changes for our veterans. At the state level, we do a pretty good job. Everything from getting 100% disabled veterans property tax exemptions to getting a veteran on the Civil Service Commission so we can get veterans jobs and promoting our veterans court system. But at the federal level, we have some problems. We need to fix the federal VA system. Veterans aren't getting the care they need. You've seen those scandals out there. I've worked hard for Veterans Affairs. That skill set that I've developed working at the state level, I feel I can transfer to the national level and help veterans. And I want to go down and make sure that they get the care that they deserve, that they've earned. I feel like I have that skill set, and I'm ready to go down there and help reform. The president is already reforming it, but he's going to need some help on that, and I want to be part of that discussion.
Gentlemen, thank you. Ken?
All right, thank you, Lynn. We're going to pause now for a quick break. More of the 18th Congressional District debate here on KDKA-TV right after this.